Most disturbing and creepiest stories. Well, this happened around 2014-2015, if I remember correctly, here in Switzerland. I find it especially disturbing since it was right about 2 villages away from where I live and many people knew the victim personally. Also, you never hear a story like this in Switzerland. It started with a news article about a house burning down. And I remember a friend in my class telling me it's the house of his friend, and both their families were really close for years. A day later, when they managed to put the fire down, they discovered 5 corpses inside. Turns out, a guy held them hostage in their own house and would compel the mother to withdraw a lot of money. Later, the security footages were released in which you could see how nervous and traumatized she looked. He ended up stealing around 10 Arias SFR. Worst part is, it was a whole family, the mother, 3 sons aged 9, 13, and 17, and the girlfriend of the oldest brother. Autopsies later have shown that the 3 sons have been raped multiple times, probably in front of the other's eyes. The offender wasn't caught until 2 years later in the middle of the city with weapons and stuff to torture people. Really horrible story. I remember my friend's mom mourning and sobbing for days. Edit, I searched the case up and it didn't went down exactly as I remembered. Apparently it is one of the most notable crimes in Swiss history. Next, Magdalena Solis, the High Priestess of Blood. In 1963, brothers Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, a pair of petty criminals, devised a scam to swindle the population of the small farming town of Yerba Buena. They proclaimed themselves high priests of the old Inca gods and that they would bring bountiful harvests and treasure to the town in exchange for donations, food, and sometimes sex. When the harvest and treasures failed to turn up, the villagers began to grow angry and suspicious. So the brothers went to Monterrey in search of a prostitute they could pay to act the part of a goddess in the farce, and made contact with Magdalena. What no one counted on was that Magdalena was insane and would quickly come to believe that she was indeed the priestess of the blood god. Only days after her arrival, Magdalena took over the cult and sacrificed 2 of the townsfolk. More human sacrifices followed, and Magdalena began to drink the blood of the victims. She forced the Hernandez brothers to drink too, and soon they came to believe that she really was the awakened Inca god Coatlicue. For 6 weeks straight, they butchered and consumed victims, with the surviving townsfolk sharing in the feast and blood orgies that followed. Only Magdalena was allowed to eat the hearts of the victims. In the middle of May, a 14-year-old kid named Sebastian Guerrero from a neighboring town investigated the weird fires and shouting coming from the cavern temple and saw dozens of people near naked, covered in blood, cutting themselves and eating the flesh of corpses impaled on pikes and scattered around the altars. On foot, he ran over 25 kilometers to the nearest police station and reported what he'd seen. The police did not take him seriously, but sent Officer Luis Martinez to take him back to the scene to make sure nothing was going on, and then drive him home. Neither of them were ever seen alive again. When Officer Martinez didn't come back, the rest of the police force called in backup from several local towns and went in force to the caves. Upon arrival, they were attacked by the cultists who had somehow attained obsidian knives and blades. Despite their ferocity, the officers managed gun down most of them and were able to arrest what remained. They found the boy, Sebastian, dead on an altar. His heart had been eaten. The officer had been dismembered, and one of the Hernandez brothers had also been mutilated and partially eaten. Solis, her remaining priests, and 12 of the townsfolk were brought to trial on 13th June, 1963. Each of them received a prison sentence of 30 years, except Solis, who was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Solis still lives to this day. She has never recanted her belief that she is the avatar of Coatlicue, the blood god. Next, my parents grew up in Colombia during the drug wars of the 80s. My dad's brother, who was 19 at the time, went out on a first date with a girl, and a few hours later, family realized he didn't come back. The situation in Colombia was so tense at the time. If somebody was late, many people already started to assume the worst. After 2 days of not hearing from him after reporting to the police and getting nothing, my dad decided to drive to this river outside the city where many drug cartels dumped bodies. He found his brother's decomposing body along with the girl he went with. Turns out a friend of the girl he went with, who was also with them at the date, confessed that the 3 of them got kidnapped by the main girl's jealous ex-boyfriend, who had recently become a member of the cartels. He took them all into the mountains, castrated them all, then shot both my uncle and his date in the head. After that, they dumped their bodies, and somehow the girl they went with got to escape and told the story days later on the news. Sadly, this is one of the hundreds of stories everybody who grew up in Colombia in the 80s knows. He is an Australian who fled to the Philippines and operated a secret dark web child pornography website known as No Limits Fun NLF, where he and others raped and murdered children and babies. They produced videos such as Daisy's Destruction, which is so extreme that it was for some time regarded as an urban legend. It features the torture and brutal rape of a number of girls by Scully and some Filipina accomplices. The 3 main victims were Liza, aged 12, Cindy, 11, and Daisy, 18 months. Margaret Aculo, then project coordinator for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and an expert on child abuse investigations, described the case as horrific and the worst she had ever heard of. His crimes were deemed so severe that some prosecutors supported the reintroduction of the death penalty as punishment for Scully, despite the fact capital punishment has been abolished in the Philippines since 2006. It still gives me the chills just thinking about it. Next. This one never gets mentioned in these threads. Several kids were kidnapped and murdered in 197677 in Michigan. The murderer would dress their bodies very nicely with freshly ironed clothes, and then display their bodies like trophies in easy-to-spot locations, sometimes right in front of a police station. When one boy was kidnapped, his mom was interviewed. She was an emotional wreck, obviously, and said she wanted her son back, just so she could take him to get his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Several days pass and the boy is found, dead, displayed as a trophy with clean clothes and his belongings neatly placed beside him. When an autopsy was performed, they recorded the contents in his stomach. It was Kentucky Fried Chicken. The killer has never been identified or caught. Next. Some of you may have heard about this one. My CJ professor was a sheriff's deputy for 27 years. One day he told us about the last case he ever worked as a homicide detective. It was so emotionally traumatic for him that he physically couldn't continue investigating homicides after the investigation concluded, and he went back to being a patrol officer for the remainder of his career. He was working in a smaller city in Arizona, a couple hundred miles away in New Mexico, a teenager, about to graduate high school, and the first of his family to be accepted into college, went missing. His family filed a missing persons report that night, after calling all of his friends and searching his local hangout places. While retracing the route he was supposed to have taken, the local police found that a gas station security camera had captured footage of him being forced into the trunk of a car by 3 armed men. The officers were able to get a make and model of the vehicle, but having been the mid-90s, the camera quality wasn't good enough to get a license plate. A few days later, somebody found a body in the woods near the town where my professor was working. When he arrived on scene, he almost threw up. According to the coroner's report, they'd sawed the kid's hands and feet off while he was alive. They then cut his stomach open, disemboweled him, poured gas all over his body, and set him on fire. According to my professor, there was evidence that he hadn't died until after the flames had gone out, as he'd dragged himself away from the spot where he'd been set on fire, and the snow around the spot where he was found wasn't melted. As the crime had happened across state lines, he worked in conjunction with both the New Mexico local police and the FBI. The investigators involved had drawn straws to see who had to be the liaison with the family, and my professor drew the short one. He said that the hardest part of the investigation was to repeatedly fly to New Mexico and personally update the family, only to tell the boy's mother that she couldn't even bury her son yet, because they didn't want to risk losing any evidence on or in the body. They'd found DNA saliva from a crack pipe that was found under a tree a few dozen yards from the body, fingerprints also from the pipe, and tire tracks in the mud, and a few months later they finally got results for the DNA. They found one of the guys in his house with a meth lab in the garage and another one sleeping in a trailer out back. They were both drugged out of their minds. They found the hacksaw that they'd used to dismember the kid, still covered in his blood, in the trunk of the car which matched the tire tracks along with 4 guns and about 15 pounds of meth and crack. When they were interviewed, they said that they didn't even remember what they did with the kid after they kidnapped him. They asked where the third man was, and all they would say is that the police wouldn't find him. All they said is that they were selling meth in New Mexico, saw him and grabbed him. They couldn't explain their reasoning. That night, one hung himself in his cell with his shirt, and the other chewed out the veins in his wrist a week later. They never found the third guy. There was DNA in the car that didn't match the other 2, but there wasn't a match in the federal database, which was still in relatively early stages at that point. As soon as that case was done with, my professor transferred out of homicide. Next. A few years ago, I worked at a call center, and one guy on my team who was probably 40-ish started talking to me, and the other guys who were all early 20s about Call of Duty. Well, turns out he and I are both into guns too. I'm like, hell yeah, I just made a friend. So he invites me to his house to shoot one day, and like we kicked it, man, just had a friendly day. So a few weeks of working together, he asks where I live, and when I tell him, he tells me his parents used to live down the street. I asked if they moved, and he dead-ass tells me this story. His perspective. My parents lived about a mile or 2 down from you. They didn't move. What happened was my sister and her boyfriend wanted money, so they killed my mother in her sleep and waited for my father to come home and shot and killed him. They tried to bury one and burn the other but were unsuccessful and got caught. My sister is actually up for parole next year, but her BF is doing life. They had an episode of some AE crime show on it a few years ago when it happened. Holy shit, yo, I was weirded the fuck out at that. Next. The Alexander family, which occurred in the 70s, yet you don't hear about it as often as you'd think. Harold and Dagmar Alexander were a married couple living in Dresden, Germany, and part of the Lower Birth Society, which was a small religious cult. The leader of the group claimed to be a prophet and the voice of God on earth, and after the leader's death, Harold claimed he inherited the prophethood. In 1954, the couple had their second child, Frank. Harold then stated that Frank was the prophet, and everything Frank said was to be taken as the word of God and law, and must be obeyed by all within the Colton family. This included his older sister, Marina, and his younger sisters, Sabine and Petra, who were twins. When Frank became a teenager is when things took a turn towards the disturbed. He decreed that having sex with someone outside of the family was impure and blasphemous, and ordered that his family only have intercourse with each other. This included his mother and sisters. Amazingly, they all agreed because they thought it was their way of serving God. Rumors about the family began to spread locally, and when police began to investigate them, the Alexanders packed up and moved to the Canary Islands. There they lived a private life and the neighbors didn't know much about them, but for the fact that they played organ music during the day and night. By December of 1970, the family had been in the Canary Islands for 10 months, and on the 22nd of December, Sabine was working as a cook at the mansion of a doctor. The doctor was surprised when Harold and Frank arrived at the villa caked in what appeared to be mud. They asked for Sabine to come out so they could speak to her, and when she did, that's when the doctor overheard them saying, "Sabine, dear, we wanted you to know at once that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." One would think that upon hearing such morbid news, she would have cried or ran away, but instead she grasped her father's blood-stained hands and said, "I'm sure you've done what was necessary." Harold then noticed the doctor was there and turned to him and admitted, "Ah, you've overheard. We've killed my wife and other daughters. It was the hour of killing." The doctor told the remaining members of the Alexander family to wait on his front patio. He ran inside and called police. The police took Harold and Frank into custody and detectives entered their apartment, to which they discovered the most gruesome scene we had ever seen. Blood was splattered everywhere, and in the living room were the corpses of Marina and Petra. Their breasts and genitals were cut out and nailed to the wall. Dagmar had been found in the bedroom and suffered the same grisly fate as her daughters. Upon questioning, Frank claimed he murdered his mother with a clothes hanger first because she looked at me wrong, and upon seeing the bloodshed, Harold claimed it was the hour of killing, so he played organ music while his son was slaughtering and mutilating his family. Both father and son claimed that the women of the family knew and accepted their roles in the foretold hour of killing which Frank had stated over the years could come at any moment, and remained unrepentant because they claimed they sent the women to heaven. Both were deemed unfit to stand trial due to mental health issues and were sent to a psychiatric hospital to remain there until death takes them. Sabine changed her name and ended up living with a coven, and her whereabouts are unknown. Next. It's hard to choose because honestly I listen to watch so much true crime. Some of the most heartbreaking are when parents torture, abuse, neglect their children to death. Then they dispose of the bodies in trash cans with fire, etc. One of the worst was the case of Adrian Jones, who was tortured to death and then had his body fed to pigs by his parents. The sheer number of these cases in Southern California alone is disheartening. But a few non-family murders that stand out. The murder of Cherish Periwinkle. She was the little girl whose mother was conned into thinking an older helpful gentleman wanted to give her a Walmart gift card to buy clothes for her daughter, so they shopped together for hours. There is so much surveillance video of them walking around the store. It's just so sad. Eventually, he took the little girl for hamburgers at McDonald's. He passed by the one in the store, took her to his van which had most of its seats removed, and then raped and murdered her. I have a very strong stomach for grisly crime, but the testimony of the medical examiner in this case stained my spirit. It was so awful. Austin Sigg murdering and dismembering Jessica Ridgway. This one is famous online for the recording in which Austin's mother calls 911 because her son has confessed to killing the girl and still having some of her remains in various places around the house. Her torso had already been found. Austin himself gets on the phone and talks to the 911 operator. He and his mother get frustrated by how many questions she asks. The trial in this one also has stomach-churning elements. Austin was well on his way to becoming a serial killer. The sexual torture murders committed and videotaped by Charles Ng and Leonard Lake. Just Google this story. It's horrifying. Similarly, the toolbox murders committed by Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris in their Murder Mac. They made audio recordings of themselves torturing, raping, and killing their female victims in brutal ways. That audio was played during the trial and it was devastating and brutal for everyone except the killers to hear. Finally, I would say the Wichita massacre committed by the Carr brothers is desperately sad. They broke into an apartment where some friends were hanging out and subjected them to a horrifying night of torture and rape before killing them. I'm pasting some of the details from the Wikipedia page about this case because if I paraphrase, no one will believe the ending. On December 14th, the brothers broke into a house at 12727 E Birchwood Drive in Wichita. Inside the property, which they had chosen at random, were Brad Haka, Heather Muller, Aaron Sander, Jason Beaufort, and his girlfriend, a young woman identified as Holly G. Before it was a local high school teacher, Heike was a director of finance with a local financial services company. Muller was a local preschool teacher. Sander, a former financial analyst who had been studying to become a priest. Holly G. was a teacher. 5. First, the Cars searched the house for valuables. Before it had intended to propose to Holly, and she found this out when the Cars discovered an engagement ring hidden in a popcorn box. After burgling the house, the Cars forced their victims to strip naked and then bound them. They then repeatedly raped the two women and forced the men to engage in sexual acts with the women and the women with each other. After taking the victims in Befort's truck to ATMs to empty their bank accounts, they drove them to the closed Stryker soccer complex on the outskirts of Wichita, where they shot all 5 execution style in the back of their heads. The Cars then drove Befort's truck over their bodies and left them for dead. Holly G. survived because her plastic barrette deflected the bullet to the side of her head. She walked naked for more than a mile in freezing weather to seek first aid and shelter at a house. Before getting medical treatment, she reported the incident and descriptions of her attackers to the couple who took her in before the police arrived. Next, the Toy Box Killer, aka Dave Parker Ray, was a killer who had accomplices such as his own daughter and friend kidnap girls. Then he would proceed to chain them up on a doctor-like table and then torture and rape them. I heard there was a mirror above the victim so they could see what was happening to them, but am not sure if that's true because I couldn't find anything on it. Dave Parker Ray would torture the victim with surgical tools, rape them himself, and used many homemade, very disturbing sex toys, and I also heard he let some friends rape his victims as well. He was good at making the sex toys because he was a mechanic. Dave would normally kill the victim or have his friend kill them by strangulation. If he didn't kill them and just drug them, he would use some sort of drugs or drug mixtures that would cause the victim to not know exactly what happened and ditch them somewhere. Police were never able to recover a body, but it's said that he killed 60 women. The reason he's called the Toy Box Killer is because the place he held women captive was a trailer near his house on the outskirts of his town. I'm not sure the town name. He called it the Toy Box or Satan's Den. Before he proceeded to torture rape his victims, he would play a tape saying this isn't going to be exact but around the same. Warning, what you read in the quotes are Dave Parker Ray's words and can be very disturbing, so be advised. Hello bitch, you already know that you are being held here against your will. You are merely a pretty piece of meat, with a nice pussy and asshole. I will proceed to rape you in all your holes, and after I will drug you so you can't remember a fucking thing. Have a good day. When I first heard it, I got chills, and it is generally creepy. He was finally arrested after he had a woman in his toy box escaped. I can't remember her name, but she was there with Dave's daughter, and she left the chain keys on the table next to her, and she lunged at it, freeing a hand, and she got free after fighting with Dave's daughter for a bit. She then fled to the neighbor who called the cops. Dave Parker Ray was arrested that day. Another thing Dave did to his victims was put them in this weird box at night while he slept. He had a trial that lasted 2 weeks. The woman that escaped testified against him, but her memory was very foggy, so she couldn't remember anything but when she was kidnapped. Dave tried to convince the jury that it was just some bondage kink, but the escaped victim called him out, but the jury was split between guilty and not guilty, so they had a retrial that lasted 2 months if I remember right. His friend testified against him and told them the truth, that he had been kidnapping girls and torturing and raping them, and said how Dave made him kill one of them. I can't exactly remember how the trial went, but he ended up getting around a 230-year sentence but died from heart failure 8 months in. That's the horrifying story of Dave Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer. Next. It happened on a reservation that I grew up on. Nice quiet native kid who was a bit standoffish but never a jerk was called to the office one day. Murders on reservations are handled by the FBI. At least that was the case when I was growing up. Anyways, he apparently was told by these FBI agents that his grandmother was found murdered. I guess they asked him if he had any information and he confessed everything. It came out that his grandmother was an alcoholic drunk that would beat this kid all the time. Grandparents tended to raise the children on the res. He got sick of it and snapped. He waited till she passed out one night, tied her up and dragged her outside. He buried her in some strange position, but up to her neck with just her head sticking out next to an ant hill. When the sun came up, he cut off her eyelids and the red ants went at her. I never heard what the actual cause of death was. So this freaked the whole fucking town out, very small town. By lunchtime, the story had gotten around our high school and the businesses in town. Our teachers announced at the end of lunchtime that school was going to be closed the next day, Friday, but we had to be back on Monday. The news was just disrupting everything. I remember going to the local trading post and the look of shock on the faces of the elders sitting on the benches in front of the store. In the store, people were talking in whispers. Everyone was in shock. It was like this happened to your own grandmother or something. Shit like this hadn't happened in a long, long time. Just writing this down, I'm chilled all over by it. We obviously never saw the kid again. He was a sophomore, but that story haunted daily conversations until I left the res a few years later. Next. Fort Worth. A Richland Hills man who kept telling his 73-year-old roommate he was tired of being tormented used a butcher knife and bread knife when he stabbed and beat her to death, according to a warrant. Stephen Tufts also killed Paula Kennemer's dog, leaving the canine dead on a patio and covered with a dog bed, the arrest warrant says. But a larger black dog found in Tufts' bedroom was alive, according to the warrant obtained by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Tufts, 27, was arrested Sunday morning at Medical City Green Oaks Hospital in Dallas. A last text to Kennemer from Tufts' mother said, "Paula, he's at the house, and my boyfriend is taking him to the crisis center at Green Oaks where his doctor is on staff," according to the warrant. He was in the Tarrant County Jail on Tuesday in lieu of $165,000 bail. He faces charges of murder and animal cruelty. The warrant gave this account of the killing. A neighbor received a telephone call from Kennemer on Friday night, saying Tufts was acting weird and coming in and out of his bedroom slamming doors. He would lie on the living room floor and kept saying he was tired of being tormented. At some point, Tufts went back into his bedroom, broke a window, climbed outside, and left on foot. Kennemer yelled at Tufts, but he ignored her. She then locked the doors and windows. The neighbor offered to come over to Kennemer's home, but she declined. Tufts returned to the Richland Hills home and climbed through the broken window in the 2800 block of Matthews Drive. Tufts asked Kennemer why she had locked him out, and she asked him why he had broken the window. The neighbor told Kennemer she wanted to call the police, but Kennemer declined, saying she was letting Tufts calm down. The neighbor hung up the telephone. She called Kennemer again at 10:37 p.m. Friday, but Kennemer did not answer. On Saturday, the neighbor called 5 times, but Kennemer never answered. Shortly before 9 p.m. on Saturday, 3 Richland Hills police officers were dispatched to a welfare check. Another neighbor had called police after going to the home and finding Kennemer's dog dead. When they arrived, Richland Hills police found the dog dead on the patio, noticing the canine had pooled blood around the mouth and showed obvious signs of trauma, according to the warrant. Officers were advised Tufts lived there, but his truck was missing. Richland Hills police entered the home and found Kennemer's body in her bedroom. She appeared to have suffered injuries to her head. 2 knives, a butcher and bread knife, were located near her body with blood on them. The bread knife was bent. After obtaining a search warrant, investigators walked into Tufts' bedroom, where they found a tennis shoe with blood splattering and cast-off blood on a t-shirt. Next has to be Dahmer, strictly because of how close I found myself to his family. Now that I have your attention, my best friend in high school had a nice older brother. We live in Ontario, Canada. He is about 3 years older than us. He dated a girl in high school, and I remember her. She seemed nice but off. They dated for all of high school, and then he ended it when he left for college. He ended up having to come back from his first semester in college because he was told by his mom that the ex was not doing well and had been committed soon after they broke up. She had cut herself a lot, cut his name, had books full of his name, and was nearly catatonic in hospital. The older brother is a caring person, so he visited her. When he gave her name, they had trouble finding her in the records. It was then that he was taken aside by the intake nurse, who explained that the reason they couldn't find her was because she had gone by her first and middle name and omitted her last name, that her name is actually Dahmer, and she is Jeffrey Dahmer's niece. When he told me about this, he remembered the last name showing up on their home caller ID as Dahmer, but he never made the connection and figured the name he knew her by was her mother's maiden name. Dahmer's parents forgave him and stayed in their hometown. His brother, on the other hand, was disgusted and moved illegally to Canada with just his only daughter. Apparently, when you live illegally in Canada, it is ill-advised to try to have your last name changed. The home phone was associated to his credit score and therefore was listed as Dahmer. The brother said goodbye to her and moved away to college finally. Next, former RRN here. Long time ago, galaxy far away thing. Not a famous case, but my very first baby code resuscitation was a murder victim. I had to give a deposition and everything. It happens really fast, and I won't give you the blow-by-blow, but they put the 10-month-old on the gurney and I'm in charge of IV access, so I stripped the ONC off of him, getting cold, pasty, gray baby poop up my arm. This is the part of my testimony that was important. You're not dead till you're warm and dead. That baby was ice cold and dead. Dad had strangled the baby 3 or 4 hours before bringing him in after a fight with Mom, and had changed his mind. I had no clue. The doctor said rigor mortis a couple times, and that didn't register as we busted our asses trying to bring that baby back for like a half hour. I was sweating balls trying to get an IV, and since I couldn't, I put 2 intraosseous lines in, 1 in each shin. Those are pretty brutal. Dad just sat there staring. He was like a zombie. No emotion, no reactions, not looking at anything or anyone really as we worked on his son, which wasn't suspicious at all. People react differently to death and tragedy. He seemed to be the normal level of so overwhelmed with what is going on that he's completely shut down. Of course, we suspected the baby had been dead for a little while. This didn't just happen. His reaction didn't make anyone think this was a murder we were dealing with, however. but he was sitting right there the whole time we worked on him, after having killed that baby. This is the part that makes this story fit this thread, and that I would define as disturbing. He murdered his child, and he was sitting right there. Mom, on the other hand, was hysterical, screaming, ripping her hair out. I don't hear her screams, but when you tell parents their child has died, they make unintelligible sounds that are more wails than screams that I still hear sometimes. This sound was more angry at the same time as anguished. The guttural, anguished ones stay with me, but hers don't. But what I understand now is she knew. She knew her husband had killed their baby, and she was grieving but wanted to get her hands on him. She wanted to tear him apart. Her family members wouldn't let her in the room with us. Yeah, it was fucked up. They fought before bed. He killed their baby and then went to sleep. Woke up a couple hours later, woke her up, admitted to her what he had done, and then they brought the baby in. It was a military base, and he was military, so pretty sure he got life. Couldn't happen to a more deserving guy. Next. Man, there's way too many just to pick one. One of the craziest ones IMO, though, was Charlie Brandt. Him and his wife were sheltering at their niece's house to get away from Hurricane Ivan. They lived in Florida. While at the niece's house, the entire time Charlie was complaining and wanted to go back to their home. Then, one day, their niece's friend, who was in regular contact with their niece, didn't hear back at all and was worried. The friend decides to go visit the house and couldn't get in because the door was locked and no one was answering, even though all the cars were there. She tries to go in through the garage, where she is given the shock of her lifetime. I think she saw it, though, a garage window or something, but she saw Charlie's body hanging in the garage. At that point, she called the police, who upon entering discovered Charlie's wife stabbed to death. The police went to the bedroom, and there they found the niece's body taken apart, disemboweled and decapitated. Her head was placed next to the body, almost as if it was made to look at what killer was doing to her. Police were trying to figure what the fuck could have happened. Most evidence suggested that Charlie Brandt was the killer, and then he killed himself, but they couldn't figure out with no motives or any past record. Until Charlie's sister came to the scene and explained everything. Police asked her what could be the reason or whatever, and then she explained Charlie has killed before, but there was no record. It's revealed that when Charlie was still a kid, I think 12 years old, and his family were all living in Indiana at the time, he had brought a gun up to his parents' bedroom and shot both of them in the bathroom. I think he shot his mom many times in the bathtub and his dad only once or twice. He then went to his sister's room and he pointed the gun at her, and movie cliche incoming, the gun goes click. At this moment, Charlie seemed to have some sort of OMG moment. What happened, as if he was never in control of himself. He started crying or freaking out and stuff, and his sister comforted him and stuff and made it seem like everything will be okay until she finally got the chance that she could run for it. She took off to the neighbors and called the police. The mother had passed away due to the wounds, but the father survived. Charlie wasn't charged for the murder because he was only 12, but he was placed in some sort of mental facility. I think he was supposed to be there a few years, but his dad idiotically took him out early. Everyone truly believed that Charlie was just possessed by a demon or something and wasn't himself for that moment. So anyways, the dad decides to relocate that family to Florida to have a fresh start, and everyone basically pretended like nothing ever happened. Everyone thought he was normal again. But over time, there was so many signs. When Charlie started seeing his wife, his sister was also already married. Charlie's brother-in-law knew the whole story from the sister. So when Charlie got married, his brother-in-law asked him if he told his wife about the thing that happened in Indiana. The brother-in-law told him that she should know. Charlie shrugged it off like nothing, basically. Charlie even apparently made some weird comments about the female's body to his brother-in-law too. No one ever took it seriously enough, though. Even the diagram on his door of the female anatomy that police found in their investigation didn't raise red flags for anyone. After figuring out what happened, police in Florida were fairly confident that Charlie could have been linked to quite a few cold cases in the area due to the manner in which he killed his wife's niece. This had never been confirmed due to lack of evidence, and the suspect currently residing in hell. I doubt how many of you are going to read this, but even if I get one upvote, it'll feel great knowing someone appreciated it. Wikipedia won't tell you the story in the order you need to hear it. I remember all of it off the top of my head from a podcast I used to listen to. Next. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, but here's one from my own life. When I was about 12 or so, there was a single woman who lived on my street, probably no more than 100 yards down from my house. She had recently gotten engaged and was planning on selling her house to move in with her fiancé. After an open house, a potential buyer asked to come by and view the house again privately, as he claimed to be very interested. It was actually an unnaturally dark and stormy day when the man came for his viewing. A few days later, a fellow neighbor became concerned because the woman used to take her 2 dogs on morning walks with this neighbor and a few others, and they had not been able to get a hold of her. She had a key to the woman's house for dog-sitting purposes and decided to let herself in. The first thing she noticed was the dogs were terribly stressed, running all over the house crying as she came in. They had also peed all over the living room. She walked through the home calling the woman's name to no response until finally she made it to the master bedroom. There in the master closet, she found her, clearly raped and strangled to death. I still remember coming home from soccer practice that day and seeing tons of police out in front of the house. The guy was actually caught pretty quickly because, get this, the realtor helping with the open house talked to this guy during the event and was so creeped out by him, she actually kept a brochure he had held, and they were able to get his fingerprints. Turns out he had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting several other women. I still think about how terrifying it must have been for that woman as this guy viciously attacked her alone her home during a terrible thunderstorm. So, there you go. Now you can be afraid of selling your house on top of whatever other illogical fears you may already have. Next. About 18 years ago in my town, a young man drove home from college out of town one night and went to his parents' house while they were sleeping. His younger brother was still living at home, and the young man killed the family dog, set the house on fire, and left to go back to college. All three in the house died, with the younger brother collapsed in a doorframe. The day after this happened, I wondered where my lab partner for aquatic science was, as it was 8:30 a.m. and he was never late. The principal came into class and whispered some quiet words to our elderly teacher, and she gasped and started crying. We all got the news right after her. The fucked up part was we all felt bad for the older brother, as he was off at college and his family all died in a house fire. We even made gifts and cards for him. Then about a week later it came out that he did the deed. It was a big uproar in town, and no one really mentioned it after about 2 years once he had been sentenced to life in prison. I honestly can't remember John's last name. I remember what he looked like, what his voice sounded like, and he liked ping pong and was better than I was at dissecting marine life. Next, I work in a children's home. One that I used to work at had this really sweet and kind young man. 14 years old, has been in foster since he was 7 but was in the home for school, etc. His birth parents would emotionally, physically, and sexually abuse him and his younger sister. They would let other people abuse the kids as well. There were certain foods he physically couldn't even look at because they would remind him of what he had suffered and would cause a visceral reaction in him. Mustard was the big one. His parents would force mustard into his mouth as a punishment. It almost made me cry listening to him. His parents were convicted but didn't really serve any time. He is not allowed any form of contact with them and isn't allowed to get the ferry to his foster parents' holidays and stuff. Comes from the Isle of Wight on his own because he saw them on the ferry and they tried to contact him. Another child was horrifically emotionally and physically abused by his mother for the first 7 years of his life. He's 12 and has an amazing guardian now. She would force him to eat fish by shoving it down his throat and then would hit him if he threw up. She would get into a physical altercation with her partner. Both were equally abusive to each other in front of the children, and he would be forced to clean her up when she would be passed out drunk and covered in piss. At 2 years old, he was found wandering the flat eating a frozen fish finger because he was so hungry. Mother still went clubbing and got drunk and high up to a week before the kid was born. Loveliest boy you would ever meet. Kind and sweet and always quick to smile. I had to give him a hug when he told me this. I was physically crying because of what he told me. Mother has never faced criminal charges, still has supervised contact with her daughter. Next, I live in the PNW. Need I say more? It seems like it's the breeding ground for serial killers. I went to dental assisting classes with a young woman, and one day during class the police showed up and knocked on the classroom door and asked her to step outside, and a few minutes later she came back in and was white as a ghost, looking a little green, visibly shaking, and she blurted out that they finally had found her mom, who had been missing for over 2 years. So we were like, wow, finally you know something. She had told the class earlier when we had to share something that she really misses her mom and hoped she would hear from her soon because she hadn't heard from her for a really long time and feared the worst, since there was a serial killer loose on the streets of Spokane. As I was helping her gather her things, she blurted out that they found her mom, Melody Ann Murfin, buried in Robert Yates's backyard, and then she fainted. We all were so stunned no one moved for a good 2 minutes, but it seemed so much longer and in slow motion. When she woke up, we helped her to the table and the police came in and escorted her to try to identify the body, clothing, jewelry, etc. Just like that, in a snap, it was so surreal. She couldn't have been much older than I was at the time, 22, and I would have crumbled and had a mental breakdown, but she held her head high, dried her tears, and walked out with them. I think of her often when I'm feeling defeated and think if she can muster up the courage to face that in 5 minutes before my eyes, I can do it too. Next. This one is a bit more recent. In August 2019, one 15-year-old girl went missing. The parents announced the police. Turned out she had been hitchhiking to get home when she got approached by a 50-ish man to get her home. She was then kidnapped by the guy who tortured, raped, and eventually killed her and burned her body. She actually managed to call the police for help, but she was ignored. A police car went to the scene but didn't go inside the old man's yard since they, well, couldn't be bothered, and they simply waited one day outside the property. The media released the recordings of the girl's voice when she begged for help, and it literally broke everyone's heart, even the most cold-hearted ones. The old guy was arrested after, and he also admitted that he did the same to another teenage girl. In May that year, 3 months prior to this incident, it caused a huge uproar in Romania. But as always, nothing has changed, and the sound of that girl's cry for help is still disturbing for me, and remember, I'm not easily impressed by violence, torture, etc. The case of Alexandra Masisanu and Luisa Malencu, if you want to search it up. Next. My father and his brother, on separate occasions, were picked up hitchhiking by John Wayne Gacy. My dad was about 17 at the time, got into the car and immediately could tell something was off. Said the guy was creepy, had a bunch of weird shit in the car and on his dashboard. When Gacy asked my dad for his name, my dad told him his brother's name. He got out of the car at a stoplight and ran away. My uncle, Dad's brother, had the same interaction a couple months later. Felt the same vibe and everything. When asked for his name, my uncle gave him my dad's name. Few months after that is when it came out in the news about Gacy, and my dad and uncle both recognized him immediately. They didn't tell each other the thing with the names till years later, but that part of the story is always funny. They were both exactly the type of Pule Gacy was looking for, but apparently had the sense to GTFO of dodge when they had the chance. It's kind of creepy to think that he was roaming around this area at one point. The prison, Stadeville Prison, where he was killed per the death sentence, is only about 15 minutes from my house. Next. Kitty Genovese was murdered by a crazy guy in New York. Her murder was reported by the New York Times a while later. It took a remark from New York City Police Commissioner Michael J. Murphy to New York Times Metropolitan Editor A. M. Rosenthal over lunch. Rosenthal later quoted Murphy as saying, "That Queen's story is one for the books," to motivate the Times into publishing an investigative report. 1322 The article, 5 written by Martin Gansberg and published on March 27, 1964, 2 weeks after the murder, claimed that 38 witnesses saw the murder, but an error reduced the number of witnesses by 1 in the headline. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. It has been quoted and reproduced since 1964 with a corrected headline of 38 who saw murder didn't call the police. 51 The public view of the story crystallized around a quote from the article by an unidentified neighbor who saw part of the attack but deliberated before finally getting another neighbor to call the police, saying, "I didn't want to get involved." 13 Many then saw the story of Genovese's murder as emblematic of the callousness or apathy of life in big cities, and New York in particular. 51 What's most disturbing is to read a more recent analysis of the truth. First, there never were 37 witnesses who did nothing. In fact, 1 called the police but nothing happened. The events happened spread out over several locations, so nobody saw more than a short bit of her encounter with the murderer. If they bothered to look out their window at all, people yell in cities all the time. The whole case was a deflection by the commissioner to stop an article about police corruption with a whataboutism _ "Hey, why aren't you writing about this horrible thing instead?" Unfortunately, on this fabrication has grown a whole myth that people in big cities won't get involved, which time after time, crime after crime has been proven very wrong. However, it's become an urban legend of our times. The 38 people who peek out their curtains as a woman was tortured and stabbed in front of them for half an hour and did nothing, just so the police commissioner could kill a negative story about the NYPD. Next, there was a case in a small German town named Hochster, which is uncomfortably near to my hometown, where a crooked couple tortured several women to death. First disclaimer, obvious trigger warning, do not read further if you can't deal with descriptions of torture, violence, sexual abuse, ASO. Second disclaimer, I am no native English speaker. Should I seemingly present things in an unsensitive manner, I am very sorry because I do not intend to do so. So there is a couple, which had a very strange marriage where he, according to her, obviously abused and tortured her all day long, as soon as he was triggered by the most basic things. When he asks her whether she will cook potatoes or pasta, and she answers wrong, she will get beaten, burnt with a flattening iron or hair dryer, tied to the heater, etc. After some time being married, they put some newspaper advertisements out there, those M40, looking for F to give her all my love things, looking for women with few social contacts who can quickly move in with them, while his original GF pretends to be his sister at first. They both immediately start to abuse their victims who move in with them, as soon as they do something wrong in their eyes, like using the toilet too loudly. The first known victim only gets to use a cat toilet at first, and is later locked up in the pig barn and eventually tied up in a bathtub in the basement, lying on her belly, hands and feet tied on her back, lying in her own feces for weeks. She can't even walk anymore after that, and at one point even tries to strangulate herself while chained to something to end her misery, which unfortunately fails. During that period of time, she also gets tortured in a horrific number of ways. Often the man gets angry about something absolutely irrational and orders his wife to torture the victim for that, according to the wife. They get even more mad when their victims cry and scream and punish them even harder for that. Some, but far from all of those tortures. beating and kicking, twisting arms, fingers etc., throwing down staircases, choking them with a blanket, until consciencelessness, boiling hot water burning with cigarettes, flattening irons etc., giving one victim food which she was highly allergic to, tit biting, literal quote, until bleeding, forcing to drink urine, defecating on the victim, forcing them to take medication. They also faked letters for their victims and forced them to sign them letters like, I, victim, tortured husband intentionally. My injuries are the result of fistfights with wife because of that. I am constantly trying to fight with wife. Husband has nothing to do with this. Wife has burned my hair with a blowtorch. I am sadistic and masochistic. Husband has nothing to do with this. I wrote this of my own free will. The second victim laid so long tied up in the bathtub that she had necrotic tissue on some parts of her body because she couldn't change position for weeks. She also had several wounds which were never treated in any way and which were also necrotic at last. She was still alive at that point. They were annoyed by her suffering. Literal quote, and decide to bring her back where she originally lived, but their car breaks down on the way, and they originally only wanted to call a cab, but because the victim is literally dying, they decide to call an ambulance. Of course, the doctors immediately become suspicious due to the nature of the countless injuries, and the two finally get arrested. Unfortunately, it is too late for their second victim, and she dies only 2 hours later in the hospital. In the end, they killed 2 women in total in that horrible manner. After the case became public, there are more women that report as former victims, reporting about also having been abused, tortured by the two. The most disturbing thing for me, though, is the aftermath. He, having an IQ of only 59, remains silent and pleads for diminished criminal responsibility. Hope it's the right word here. She, being quite intelligent with an IQ of 120, deliberately gives the police every little detail, presenting the story as if she has always also been a victim that he forced to do all the terrible things. She even gives the police a list of 50 torturing methods of them and all the details they need. In the end, he gets 13 years with subsequent psychiatric detention, which is basically lifelong, and she only gets 11 years, with no such subsequent detention. I can't shake off the feeling that she is at least as involved in the violent acts as he is, and at least as crooked as he is, and that she, unlike him, has the intellect to manipulate the situation in such a way to pretend being only a victim to get away with less of a punishment. Some of the surviving victims also reported that she was also violent when not being forced by him or being ordered to. Maybe I am wrong there and doing her injustice, but man, when such a person is potentially wandering around in my area in a decade. Next. This is going to get buried, but Susan Leigh Smith. She blamed an unnamed black man for the deaths of her 2 young children, 3 years and 14 months of age, during a carjacking that ended in her vehicle being submerged in a lake with the children inside. For 9 days, she advocated for the arrest of her alleged perpetrator on the behalf of her beloved boys. It was only later that she admitted to lying about the murders, and that she had actually allowed her car to roll into the water with the children inside in order to gain the affections of a local wealthy man. What's more, after she was imprisoned, she apparently got pregnant several times and was involved in the discharge of a co with whom she had illegal relations. He was found to have smuggled and shared contraband with her in the prison. She was then sent to a prison near my hometown. But it doesn't stop there. Not for me, at least. My dad briefly worked delivering concessions to the local prison alongside a man who had been doing it for far longer, but now required assistance. While my dad was stalking, he looked up to see a female inmate standing across from him, supposedly waiting for concessions. As they briefly met eyes, she gave him a wink and a suggestive wave before walking away. And as my dad's coworker later told him, that was Susan Smith. It freaked him the hell out reasonably. Next. My sister went to a high school, had pretty good relationship with her teacher, and he even gave her movies on flash drives few times, good old days. He asked her few times where she lives and stuff about our family of 6 at that time. She didn't tell him anything, thankfully. She graduated and left the school. After some time, there were news. The teacher killed his student girl with same name as my sister. Story goes like this: he built relationship with the poor girl, got her info, took his 3 guns, lot of ammunition, and went to her house. Killed the girl and her grandfather and injured her grandmother. He got 24 years. He said that his 17-year-old student was seducing him. Most FD up thing is that his wife drove him to the Gersel house. Most disturbing for me, because if my sister said where we live, my 3 sisters, mother, father, and me would be in danger. I don't want to imagine what could have happened. Next. One of the worst cases I can think of is that of Justin Ross Harris. He was convicted of killing his 22-month-old son by accidentally leaving him in a hot car. This was in the summertime, southern US, while Harris was at work. Harris' defense was that he didn't follow his morning routine the day of the incident, and that it was an accident. Upon looking through his phone, however, prosecutors found that Harris was a serial cheater, including with one partner who was still a minor and was expressing his disillusionment with married life and fatherhood to several of his mistresses. Harris' internet search history also included queries related to the dangers of being left in a hot car. His wife was totally unaware of his cheating or his plan for their son and initially thought it was all an accident. I can only imagine how devastated she was as the trial unfolded and the evidence of Harris' true nature piled up. The reason this story is so horrid to me is how outwardly normal the Harris family seemed. They looked like a regular happy couple with a wonderful child. But all of this was just a facade for Justin Ross Harris, who was secretly plotting to tear his family apart for a purely selfish gain, trapping an innocent child unaware of his fate in the middle of his horrible scheme. Next, Michael Alig was the king of the club kids in New York in the 90s. He shifted the look of the club kids, who were originally just weird, into the direction of being obsessed with gore and death. A poster for one of his parties showed someone being hit in the head with a hammer and having their legs cut off. Everybody thought it was just fun and games. His fame made him think he was untouchable, and for a long time he was. He started pushing the envelope and got more and more fucked up to the point of sociopathy. One day he and his friend hit their other friend Angel in the back of the head with a hammer, smothered him to death, brought him to the tub and shoved Drano down his throat and taped it shut. They left his body in there, just pouring Drano and perfumer on him every couple of days until his body began to rot. All the while he kept throwing parties, saying that the bathroom was off limits. Everyone complained of the smell, but he threw great parties so they kept coming back. They finally decided they need to get rid of the body. He saws off his legs just like he did in his famous poster, and put his legs in one cardboard box and his torso and head in another, and left them out in the living room. He still continued to throw parties while a body was right there in the middle of the room. For months afterward, he wore the victim's famous red boots and everyone in town knew who they belonged to. He would invite people over, kick his new boots around as a signal and ask his friends, "Who's missing lately?" Think about who's missing. Eventually, he dragged the body down the elevator and into a cab and paid the driver $20 to help him throw the body in the Hudson River. He forgot to poke holes in the boxes and they never sank. They floated ashore on Long Island and were found by 2 kids. Meanwhile, Michael's bragging escalated, and when people asked where his friend Angel went, he just kept telling people, "Oh, I killed him and dumped his body in the river." Some of his friends thought it was his fucked up sense of humor. Others thought he was telling the truth but was too untouchable to do anything about it. When Angel's family came to New York to look for him, Michael fled out of state, but he got tired of not being able to brag about his kill, so he moved back and kept bragging about it at all the clubs. Finally, he went on live TV and said, "I killed Angel," and "That's the kind of thing that gets me in trouble," then laughed. Next, the Jessica Dishon cold case is one that's disturbing. This girl was just sitting at home one day, getting ready for school in the Kentucky countryside, when she suddenly disappeared. As her family got home from work, school, etc., they realized she wasn't there, an unusual characteristic for her. They went out to look for her in the middle of the night and found a suspicious neighbor burning similar clothes. This suspicious neighbor was taken in for questioning and failed a lie detector test. Not long after, he was taken into court long before the prosecution was ready to make a case. During a witness session with a police officer, the officer admitted that the only reason they brought the man to court was because he failed a lie detector test. The judge immediately called off the court, as that is no excuse to bring a man to court. The case had officially gone cold. 12 years later, in the early 2010s, someone new looked into the case. At first, they had nothing to go off of, but when they contacted the defense lawyer in that court case so many years ago, they found a treasure trove of information that was never revealed. This included many new suspects that the police either didn't know of or didn't care enough to look into. Among them Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, who had previously made several unusual advances to even people of his own family. All investigators know for sure about that day long ago is that Stanley Dishon kidnapped Jessica from her own home, likely raped her, and then left her body in a shallow grave in the middle of the woods and covered it with lime so that it couldn't be found by dogs. The most disturbing thing about this case is that a trusted family member kidnapped one of Thea's own family, raped her, killed her, and buried her in a shallow grave. How the literal heck do you live knowing you did something like that, and to your own family? Next, when I was around 8 or 9, there was a murder on the house next to us. It was at the Habana, so houses there are pretty close one to the other. Long story short, the neighbor was involved with illegal activities mostly involving drugs according to media, and my parents, who remember more, apparently said day he got a visit from one of the person who worked with for him. IDK what lead to it, but the visitor got killed. He was knocked out from the back of his head and later on placed in the bathtub. The neighbor and one of his friends tried to get rid of the body by cutting it bit by bit, arms, legs, head, torso and so on, and putting the parts into bags so then they'll throw it on desert places or under the bridges. The disturbing part is that he was a good neighbor. He was really nice to me and my family from what I was told. They killed and amputated parts of a body in the house right beside of mine, which windows were one side to another. The only thing sparing both houses was the tight corridor leading to our patio. We never suspected, saw, or heard anything. The events were so disturbing and popular enough that they made an episode out of it on a Cuban CSI Tras las Huelas. Next. This happened when I was in high school and it got some national attention, but then quickly faded out once the guy was sentenced. A 9-year-old girl went missing a few days before Christmas, and a citywide search went on for her. She and her siblings were staying at the home of Michael Plumador, a man who had taken care of their grandfather until he passed, while their mother was recovering from an illness. Michael said he wasn't sure what happened to her and that he woke up and she was missing. The siblings said they saw her go outside in the early morning hours. At the time, they believed she was either sleepwalking, as she was known to do, she thought it was a school day and left to go to the bus stop. The FBI ended up becoming involved, where they found her chopped up and dismembered torso, legs and arms in a nearby dumpster behind a local bar. They found blood residue on Michael's front steps leading into his trailer, as well as a brick. They found that he had her head, hands, and feet in his freezer. He had bludgeoned her to death on his porch, hid the body in the freezer until later when he took a hacksaw to it, and then during the early morning hours he dumped the body behind the local bar. I will never forget this because I was outside said bar while my mom had gone inside to talk to the manager. I had seen a strange guy going around the back of the building with a large bag. I didn't think it was strange at the time until I saw his mugshot. Next, Jessica Chambers. There is not a whole lot written on the specifics of her death. This YouTube video is the most comprehensive overview I ever found on it, but it was believed that she was sexually assaulted and choked to the point of unconsciousness, then driven to an isolated area in her vehicle. The killer returned and doused her and her car in gasoline, pouring it down her nose and throat, then lighting her on fire. She and her car were left cooking for 30 minutes before emergency services arrived. The car was so hot that the black paint turned white. She was burned over 98% of her body, including her nose and throat. But she wasn't dead when the firefighters arrived. She was alive and walking towards the firefighters when they arrived. Jessica tried to answer their questions to the best of her ability, including who did this to her and her name, but they were distorted responses from the swelling to her lips and throat. She didn't die until the next morning, surrounded by family. The killer was linked by GPS video surveillance and gave multiple easily disproven alibis. The key set to Jessica's car was found in his sister's house with his DNA on it. The killer has had 2 mistrials so far. At last word, he was still facing trial for torturing and stabbing an exchange student 30 times, a crime he was linked to because he stole her debit card, called the bank from his very own phone number, and tried to get access to the account, all after the murder. And he was in possession of the debit card. He didn't deny stealing the card, but denied the murder. Jessica Chambers' murder haunts me for not only its horrific and torturous nature, but how much she fought to the end. Next, Joel Guy Jr. murdering his parents. The son was a professional college student who had never worked a day in his life. On Saturday, November 26, 2016, 61-year-old Joel Guy Sassar and 55-year-old Lisa Guy were murdered and dismembered by their son, 28-year-old Joel Michael Guy Jr., in Knoxville, Tennessee. The younger guy stabbed his father at least 42 times, his mother at least 31 times. He was convicted of both murders in October 2020 and received a sentence of life imprisonment. Guy's parents were soon to retire and would stop providing money to their son, and he was to receive a $500,000 life insurance policy if both were dead or missing. The murder involved an elaborate plot to stab both parents, dismember and dissolve their remains, and clean and burn down the house, as well as frame the father for the crime. Guy was injured during the stabbing and left the partially dissolved remains in the house as he left to dress his wounds. Before he returned, police discovered the bloody scene upon performing a welfare check. They also discovered a notebook detailing the plot in a backpack, both parents' torsos and dismembered limbs dissolving in plastic bins, in an acid-based solution full of corrosive chemicals described by prosecutors as a diabolical stew of human remains, the father's severed hands on the floor, and the mother's head in a pot on the stove. Next, Mexican here, La Maravillitas. A story you seriously cannot make up. It would be deemed too far-fetched for a movie. An illiterate woman with a turbulent, to say the least, past turned to pro wrestling to make money, then an injury leaves her unable to perform anymore. She resorts to robbing houses as a source of income, her targets being women aged 60 and up. She then started posing as a public healthcare nurse to gain access to the houses of said women, killed them, then cleaned the house of any valuables. Yes, she did use wrestling moves to immobilize and asphyxiate a decent chunk of them, with telephone wires and clotheslines being also popular choices. In a sick sort of way, she cared for her victims after they were dead, placing their corpses in dignified, comfortable positions. She also kept mementos of every woman she killed because, duh. She was so prolific due to the incompetence and homophobia misogyny of our police force, whom, for the longest time, thought they were looking for either a male or trans murder. They literally arrested every trans near the area they could find, without charges, and refused to elaborate. It took a protest of the local LGBT community in front of the police station for the cops to release the illegally detained suspects. In the end, she was caught because a tenant of one of her victims came back home unexpectedly and found the corpse, called the police, and distinctly remembered the woman. Did I mention one of the attempted capture methods was to pay old women to look the part and act as bait? Next, there is a story of a woman named Alison Botha. Botha was kidnapped by some Satanist named Franz du Toit and Theans Kruger. They took her to a deserted site behind some bushes, violently raped her, lacerated her throat 16 times, was stabbed in the stomach over 30 times, her head was nearly decapitated. This goddess crawled 90 meters with her intestines in her hand and holding her mostly severed head upright. She was found by some motorist and taken to the hospital where she survived her injuries. She wanted children badly, but the injuries were so severe that they didn't think she would be able to have children. 8 years later, she has 2 children. My absolute favorite story of survival. Next, a body of a young girl was found in a tree line behind my parents' house one winter. Her body had been burned to hardly resemble a person. It was a high school girl from my small town. Even worse, it was my friend's younger brother that did it. He apparently picked her up and went down the road my parents live on and bludgeoned her with a hammer and tried to cover it up. My friend had moved out, but his mom still lived in the house. I guess his brother was high and drove his truck into their backyard and threw his clothes in a barrel to burn them, barely doing either correctly. I had played video games with this guy and even shared beers, but last time I had seen him he was smoking salvia and getting into harder drugs. Crack and meth, I think, but I'm not certain. His family felt forced to move away. That was the strangest thing. People in town really came after his family like they had anything to do with it. Next. It's not the most disturbing. I honestly can't remember the names of half the people I've read about, but the latest one I read was about the Coronation Street killer, aka Daniel Bartlam. He was a teen when he did this. He killed his mother, went and had a shower to get the blood off and stuff, went back and set his mother's bed on fire, took his brother and dog out of the house as the whole house was in flames, and was called a hero for saving them. He was praised by hundreds of people. Later on, though, police found out that the fire was started by petrol and they started to suspect Daniel. He had written a whole script on how this would play out. Every detail that was written, he did that day, including saving his brother and dog. He did try to delete the script off of his laptop, but the police found it. If I remember correctly, he was named the Coronation Street Killer because of how normal the series is. Like it's real life almost, but on TV with murders and all that stuff. He was obsessed with it, as well as tons of horror movies and stuff, which he would spend literally every day watching. The script he wrote was very much like the show he loved. Anyway, I'm bad at explaining, but it was kind of interesting. Next. My best friend from 9th grade wound up a murderer. A friend's grandma had some money tied up somewhere and her grandson wanted it. He got my friend in on it and the two plotted her murder. My friend ended up being the killer, her grandson the mastermind and driver. So, as I understand it, he found her in her home, slashed her with a knife, then demanded she open her bank account and write a check for the amount. She had a bloody hand that fouled the first check, so he bandaged her hand and had her do another. He then tried strangulating her to death. That didn't work. Tried breaking her neck. That didn't work. Stomped her throat. That didn't work. So he ended up stabbing her and throwing her down the basement steps. They left and later came back for a safe full of government CDs. She was 79, they were around 18. Brock got life WO parole and Robbie got 30 years, both on first-degree murder. He was a fantastic guy when I knew him. One of the only people in that godforsaken hellhole of a school who was kind to me. It's after I left that he got in with the wrong crowd via a girl, or so my other friend tells me. Next. I'm living in France, down in the countryside. It's pretty much empty, and there's a story that still give me chills even tough it won't happen twice. A guy in the next village went crazy one night. Full moon and alcohol are the motives, belonging to persons who used to know him. And he decided to take revenge on his ex-wife 10 years after they broke up, took an hunting crossbow and went to her house, killed her and her actual husband. The guy couldn't live with it. He hanged himself on a tree. Aside the road between his and my village, a guy working on the fields found the corpse. Still today, this place where he put an end to his days is creepy as fuck. Tiny mountain road, with only space for one car, no network. Other crimes happen later in the same village for different reasons. We used to speak about it like a cursed place, but honestly it's a remote one, who cares? Here's my story. Have a couple other ones in reserve. Next. The Bigay schoolgirl murders. They took place in the Australia region of Bigay, which is famous for a brand of cheese on a long weekend. I think it was Labor Day. 2 girls, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, left to walk from a campsite they were staying at to, I believe, a mutual friend's house, but disappeared along the way. They were forced into the car of 2 long-time convicts who were high on meth. The perpetrators insisted they got in of their own accord, but family and friends insist they must have been forced because they'd never get into a stranger's car. It's impossible to know because the girls are dead and the only other two who may know are the murderers and not exactly trustworthy. They drove around with the girls all night, driving toward Sydney and raping both girls repeatedly and threatening them with knives. Eventually, they ended up at a place 2 hours from Bigay. They had doubled back at one point. It was bushland, and they forced the girls to a creek where they had to undress and wash off all the evidence. The girls were then separated and could hear but not see each other. At first, they attempted to drown the 14-year-old in the creek, but she struggled and enraged him. She stabbed her in the neck, and she died from a mixture of this stab wound and drowning. She had a much easier death than her friend who was tied to a tree, as if she were bear hugging it. She had heard her friend's murder, so she would have known what was coming. The 16-year-old had her throat cut 2 to 3 times, but this didn't kill her. Her killer kicked her repeatedly, stabbed her in the neck, in the chest, kicked her in the head multiple times, stood on her, but after all this ultimately waited until she stopped flailing on the ground. It took about a month for police to track them down, with them eventually confessing and leading police to the bodies. The pair had 200 convictions between them, so how the hell they were free beats me. One of them has also since been sentenced for the murder of Prue Bird, a 13-year-old girl several years before the double murder. He claimed her murdered Prue because she refused to tell him where her father was, and he believed her father had sexually abused him. He said he got angry and strangled her. The prosecution states that she was killed by him and another now dead man in a premeditated sexually motivated homicide. Her body has never been found as he refuses to divulge the location. Next, the murder of Junko Furuta. She was kidnapped, horribly assaulted, and tortured for about 44 days by 4 teenage boys. This all took place at one of the boys' house with his older brother and parents all present in the home, and all turned a blind eye to whole situation. They were also said to have brought at least 100 people over to show off their crime. This all happened while the news constantly reported her missing because she was an extremely smart student and I believe top in her class prior to graduation. I think she was also going to attend a prestigious internship, so her disappearance was very much noticed. She attempted to escape multiple times and got very close once. When she finally died, they stuffed her into a concrete barrel and left her in an abandoned lot until she was discovered. Due to the age of the boys, they all received extremely light sentences due to Japanese law, despite public outcry. They were all released and given new identities. I believe most have since married and started families, while I believe only 1, maybe 2 went on to commit other crimes. I couldn't bring myself to reread this tragedy, but there is link below if you can stomach it. Concrete Girl Case. Another tragic death is that of Kelly Ann Bates. She was a teenager with a much older boyfriend predator. He tortured her mentally, then ultimately physically for a long time before her body gave out. Her death was very violent and tragic. I think among the worst case in England. Next, Ella Verne's Purple Hill double homicide. This isn't the most awful true crime story, but it happens very close to home for me, just down the street and up a hill. It had an enormous effect on our community, and I'd like to share a piece I wrote on it. In a quiet town nestled in between Claremont and San Dimas, California, just north of the Pomona Raceway and the LA County Fairgrounds. Anyone who's driven along the 210-foot-hill freeway has seen the house up on its once beautiful purple-colored hill along Rough Riders Road. The hill had been a true sight to see, covered in the bright purple flowers tended by the property owners Shirley 74 and Army Troy 89 Isom, who after their murder wilted and died, leaving only grass and haunting vacant home that can be seen from anywhere in the town. It was day after Christmas, DC 262014, when a student visiting friends while on winter break saw a man carrying a heavy bag with him towards the house on Purple Hill. The student described the man as a Hispanic male in his late 20s and early 30s. He didn't know it then, but that man was Luke Fabela, 27, a local transient with a history of violence and drug abuse. Luke Fabela believed that the elderly couple were wealthy and that they could have money hidden away on their property. It was with this in mind he set out to brutally torture and murder the elderly couple. When Luke arrived, he forced his way into the house. His assault was described as a blitz attack where he quickly rushed the elderly couple, demanding the money that he believed was hidden along the property from Shirley and Army. The few details I know personally about the exact happenings are town rumor, so I will omit them here. What is known is that at some point during the struggle, Luke Fabela killed both Shirley and Army Isom with a blunt object after stabbing them both multiple times. No money had ever existed. After the brutal murders, Luke Fabela fled, leading the police on for more than a month before being arrested on February 3rd. Luke Fabela was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murders, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and first-degree residential burglary. Amongst the community of Lavenre, Shirley and Army Isom will never be forgotten, and for me personally, I will never forget the beauty of the flowers they tended up on their Purple Hill.